June 1944. Somewhere along the railway line between Smolensk and Minsk. Zhukov stood at a rail yard, watching a military train crawl past at walking speed. His jaw tightened. Behind schedule, again. 3,000 kilometers of track, tens of thousands of rail cars. And somehow, not enough of them were moving fast enough. He checked his watch. 17 days until the largest Soviet offensive of the war, and the trains were running late. What Zhukov was attempting had never been done before, not by any army in human history. Stalin had approved an operation so massive that it made D-Day look modest by comparison. While the Americans and British were landing 156,000 men on the beaches of Normandy, the Soviets were quietly assembling something far larger in the forests of Belarus. 2.3 million soldiers, 6,300 tanks, 45,000 artillery pieces, 8,000 aircraft. All of it had to arrive in position within 3 weeks. All of it had to remain invisible to German reconnaissance. And all of it depended on the Soviet railway system, a system that was, at this moment, failing. Zhukov picked up the phone to Moscow. His co-commander, Marshal Vasilevsky, had already called. Both men delivered the same message to Stalin. The rail movements were behind schedule. Divisions were stacking up at transfer points. Equipment was arriving without crews. Crews were arriving without equipment. If something did not change immediately, they would have to delay the offensive. Stalin listened. Then he said something that revealed exactly how he ran the Soviet war machine. "I will speak to Kaganovich." Lazar Kaganovich was not a general. He had never commanded troops in battle. But in the Soviet system, he might have been the most powerful man in the war effort after Stalin himself. Since March 1942, Kaganovich had served as People's Commissar of Railways. He controlled every locomotive, every railcar, every kilometer of track in the Soviet Union. But here is what made Stalin's call significant. General Andrei Krylev already held the position of Chief of the Main Directorate of the Rear, essentially the head of all military logistics. In any other army, the supply chief and the railway chief would have been separate powers, often working against each other, not in Stalin's Soviet Union. Stalin had given Krylev both positions. One man controlled military supply and civilian railways. It was an arrangement no other country in the war had achieved. When Stalin called Kaganovich, he was not asking. He was activating a system designed for exactly this moment. Within hours, everything changed. Railway officials who had been juggling civilian and military priorities suddenly found their priorities clarified. Military trains moved first. Everything else waited. Dispatchers who had been following standard procedures received new procedures. The new procedure was simple. Bagration cargo moves immediately. No exceptions, no delays, no excuses. And for anyone who still didn't understand the urgency, there was an unspoken reminder. In 1941, Stalin had executed several railway officials for failures during the German invasion. The Soviet railway system had an institutional memory of what happened when Stalin was disappointed. The trains began to move faster. By the end of the first week, the numbers were staggering. 373 military trains per day were now rolling toward Belarus. Each train carried between 1,500 and 2,400 troops, or equivalent tonnage in tanks and artillery. That is not 373 trains total. That is 373 trains every single day. Do the math. At the lower estimate, that is 560,000 soldiers per day in theoretical capacity. Even at a fraction of full capacity, the Soviets were moving more men in a week than most armies move in a year. They were not just moving men. They were moving entire tank armies. They were moving artillery divisions with hundreds of guns each. They were moving enough ammunition to sustain weeks of continuous combat. Somewhere in a German headquarters, an intelligence officer was looking at the same railways, or trying to. Soviet maskirovka, military deception, was operating at full effectiveness. Trains moved primarily at night. During the day, troops dispersed into forests. Tanks were covered with camouflage netting. Radio silence was absolute. German aerial reconnaissance saw nothing unusual. The intelligence assessment went up the chain. The Soviets were clearly preparing something, but the main attack would come in Ukraine. That's where the strategic objectives were. That's where the Soviets had attacked before. Belarus was a secondary theater. The assessment was logical. The assessment was also catastrophically wrong. Here's what German intelligence didn't know. At that very moment, 7 complete armies were moving into position in Belarus. 11 aviation corps were relocating to forward airfields. More than 200,000 replacement troops were flowing toward the front. The Soviets had learned from bitter experience. At Kursk the previous year, German intelligence had estimated 1,500 Soviet tanks facing them. The actual number was 5,100. That's not a rounding error. That's an intelligence failure of 3,600 tanks. The Germans had missed more tanks than most countries owned. And now, in Belarus, the Soviets were hiding an even larger force. Despite Kaganovich's intervention, Zhukov and Vasilevsky sent another message to Stalin. The original launch date, June 18th, was not achievable. They needed more time. 4 more days. Stalin agreed without argument. The offensive was pushed to June 22nd. There's a dark irony in that date. June 22, 1944 was exactly 3 years to the day after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion that had nearly destroyed the Soviet Union. Whether Stalin chose the date deliberately or it simply fell that way, the symbolism was unmistakable. On the 3rd anniversary of their greatest humiliation, the Soviets would launch their greatest victory. At 5 a.m., thousands of Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The Germans called it Trommelfeuer, drum fire, a continuous roar of explosions so dense that individual shots blurred into a single, endless thunder. Then came the infantry, then the tanks. Within hours, the German defensive line, which had held for nearly 2 years, began to collapse. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding Army Group Center, requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. Hitler refused. Busch requested permission to shorten his lines. Hitler refused. Busch reported that his divisions were being encircled. Hitler replaced him with Field Marshal Walter Model, his best defensive commander, the man who had stabilized the Eastern Front multiple times before. Model arrived, assessed the situation, and told Hitler the truth. Army Group Center was being destroyed. There was nothing he could do to stop it. By July 4th, 12 days into the offensive, Army Group Center had effectively ceased to exist. 28 of 34 German divisions were destroyed or severely mauled. 350,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Some estimates place total German losses closer to 400,000. To put that in perspective, German losses at Stalingrad, the battle that shocked the world, were approximately 800,000 over 5 months. Bagration inflicted comparable casualties in weeks. On July 17, 1944, something extraordinary happened in Moscow. 57,000 German prisoners of war were marched through the streets of the Soviet capital. Columns of defeated soldiers stretched for miles, watched by crowds of Soviet citizens. The message was unmistakable. The war had turned. The army that had nearly conquered Moscow in 1941 was now parading through it as prisoners. After the prisoners passed, Soviet street cleaning trucks followed behind them, symbolically washing away the contamination of the invaders. Let us return to Zhukov's complaint about the railways. In approximately 3 weeks, The Soviet railway system had delivered a staggering array of forces and material, all moved in secret and all arriving in time. 2.3 million soldiers to their assembly positions, 6,300 tanks and self-propelled guns, 45,000 artillery pieces and mortars, 8,000 aircraft to forward airfields, millions of tons of ammunition, fuel, and supplies. All of it moved in secret, and all of it arrived in time. When Zhukov complained that the trains were too slow, Stalin made a phone call. 3 weeks later, the largest ground offensive in human history was ready to launch. Consider the scale of what the Soviets achieved. D-Day, Operation Overlord, is rightly celebrated as a logistical masterpiece. The Western Allies landed 156,000 troops on June 6, 1944, building to over 2 million by the end of the summer. Operation Bagration began with 2.3 million troops already in position on day one. The Allies crossed the English Channel, a journey of roughly 100 miles across open water. The Soviets moved their forces across 3,000 kilometers of railway, through territory that had been devastated by 3 years of war, while hiding everything from German reconnaissance. This is not to diminish D-Day. It is to recognize that the Eastern Front operated on a scale that defies easy comprehension. General Andrei Krylev rarely appears in popular histories of World War II. He was not a battlefield commander. He never led a charge or planned an encirclement, but his dual role, controlling both military logistics and the railway system, was arguably the key to Soviet operational success from 1943 to 1945. In the German system, military supply and civilian railways were separate bureaucracies with competing priorities. Every ton of steel sent to the front was a ton not available for civilian production, and vice versa. Every dispute required adjudication at the highest levels. In Stalin's system, one man made those decisions. When Bagration needed the railways belonged to Bagration. It was brutally efficient. It was also only possible under a dictatorship willing to subordinate everything, civilian needs, economic considerations, individual lives, to military necessity. Soviet casualties in Operation Bagration are often overlooked. Official figures list approximately 180,000 killed and 590,000 wounded, roughly 770,000 total casualties. These numbers are likely understated. Soviet casualty reporting during the war was notoriously incomplete. Some historians estimate the true figure may be closer to 800,000. That means the Soviets suffered nearly as many casualties winning Operation Bagration as the Germans suffered losing it. This was the mathematics of the Eastern Front. The Soviets won not because they did not suffer, they suffered enormously. They won because their mobilization system could sustain losses that would have broken any other army and still generate the forces needed for the next offensive. When Zhukov complained about the trains, he was not just solving a logistics problem. He was demonstrating something fundamental about how the Soviet Union fought the war. In the Western democracies, military operations were constrained by politics, by public opinion, by the competing demands of civilian society. This was not weakness, it was the nature of democratic warfare. In Stalin's Soviet Union, there were no such constraints. When the military needed the railways, the military got the railways. When the offensive needed 4 more days, it got 4 more days. When the plan required 2.3 million soldiers to materialize in Belarus, they materialized. 2.3 million. The cost was borne by the Soviet people, in the soldiers who died in the offensive, in the civilians whose needs were subordinated to military production, in the prisoners and laborers who built and maintained the railways under brutal conditions. The cost was enormous. This is the uncomfortable truth about Operation Bagration. It was a masterpiece of military logistics and operational planning. It was also only possible because Stalin's system could mobilize resources, human and material, without the constraints that limited democratic nations. 3 weeks. That is how long it took to turn Zhukov's complaint into Hitler's nightmare. 3 weeks. When the trains ran late, Stalin made a phone call. When Kaganovich received that call, the entire Soviet railway system bent to one purpose. When the offensive finally launched, 4 days late but fully prepared, it destroyed an entire German army group in less than a month. The Germans never recovered. From June 1944 until the end of the war, the Wehrmacht retreated almost continuously on the Eastern Front. There would be counterattacks, local successes, desperate defensive stands. But the strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Soviets, all because the trains ran on time. Or more precisely, because when they did not, Stalin had built a system that could make them. Trains. The Soviet railway system moved 373 military trains per day during Bagration, more daily traffic than most railway systems handle in a week. Operation Bagration liberated all of Belarus, most of Lithuania, and part of Poland in 8 weeks. Field Marshal Model, sent to try to save Army Group Center, later told Hitler that Army Group Center had ceased to exist.